The dust along the narrow country lane leading up to the old homestead in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee had a way of settling on everything, coating the faded blue trim of the porch and the dry grass with a fine, reddish powder. That hot August afternoon, the sun hung heavy over the Appalachian Ridge, casting long, coppery shadows across the yard. Nora stood by the rickety cedar fence, one hand supporting the small of her aching back and the other resting gently over the swell of her 7-month belly. She was only 29 years old, but her hands were already calloused from hard labor, and her dark hair was pulled back into a simple, tight knot at the nape of her neck. Draped over her shoulders was a worn woolen shawl that had belonged to her mother, its fringe frayed by time and constant use. Underneath that shawl, she carried a promise and a terrifying uncertainty all at once. She had spent the last of her savings, literally the very last silver coins she possessed in this world, on a creature that no one else wanted. Behind her in the small dirt paddock stood an old, scrawny nanny goat with matted white hair, visible ribs, and a belly so heavy with late pregnancy that the animal swayed with every labored step. The folks down in the valley town had called Nora a fool, a young widow, living all alone at the dead end of a mountain hollow with no family nearby, throwing away her final pennies on a dying animal, when she barely had enough cornmeal to see herself through the coming autumn. Leaning against the wooden fence post, watching the goat listlessly chew on a dry clump of grass, Nora didn't know if she had just committed the greatest mistake of her life, or the only decent thing left to do. What she could never have imagined, as the sun slowly dipped behind the pine-covered hills, was that this skinny, unwanted animal was about to change the trajectory of her entire life. Nora's small frame cottage sat at the very end of Old Creek Road, a winding dirt track that few people ever had reason to travel unless they were lost. The house was humble, built decades earlier out of rough-hewn timber that had weathered into a soft silver gray. The front door had once been painted a bright sky blue, but the mountain sun and harsh winters had peeled it down to bare wood in long, jagged strips. Around the yard, there was little else besides a dry vegetable patch, a small barn constructed from pine poles bound together with wire, and a towering agave plant growing stubborn and green right beside the stone foundation. It was a place isolated enough to offer complete silence, yet close enough to the valley town for the faint chime of the church bell to carry over the ridge on a clear morning. To survive, Nora washed and ironed clothes for 3 of the wealthier families down in town. Twice a week, she made the long trek down the hill, gathered their heavy bundles of bed linens, Sunday shirts, and tablecloths, and hauled them back up to her homestead in a canvas sack. She spent endless hours hunched over a heavy wooden washtub in the yard, scrubbing the fabric against a metal washboard with homemade lye soap until her knuckles were red and raw. Once the clothes were bleached clean by the midday sun, she heated heavy iron flats over a wood stove and pressed every collar and cuff with a care that bordered on reverence. The work earned her only a few quarters and dimes a week, just enough to buy a bag of flour, a small sack of salt, and a tin of lard from the general store. But it was honest work, and Nora held her head high, knowing she earned her bread without begging. Her days always began long before the neighbor's rooster down the road finished his first morning crow. By 5 o'clock in the morning, Nora would stir the embers in her small cast-iron stove, add a few splits of seasoned hickory, and set a pot of water on to boil. She made herself a thin portion of cornmeal porridge, always leaving half in the pot in case the coming days proved even leaner than the present. While she worked at the tub, scrubbing line after line of heavy denim and cotton, she sang softly under her breath, old mountain ballads and gospel hymns whose origins she couldn't even recall, passed down through generations of mountain women. Sometimes, when the silence of the hollow grew too heavy, she would talk down to her swelling belly. She talked to her unborn child about the weather, about the red-tailed hawk circling over the ridge, or about the quiet beauty of the wild mountain laurel. In those unanswered conversations, she found a strange, comforting warmth that kept the cold shadow of loneliness at bay. She was entirely alone, and everyone in the valley knew it, even if no one asked about the details anymore. When Nora had first found herself in this situation, the gossip down at the town square had been sharp and relentless. People whispered behind their hands outside the post office, and the older women sitting on the porch of the general store shook their heads with a pity that cut deeper than open disdain. Over time, the townsfolk grew accustomed to seeing the quiet, dark-haired woman walking along the shoulder of the road with her heavy bundle of laundry, and the whispering slowly died down into indifference. But the truth of her life, the deep, aching truth that weighed on her soul every night, was something Nora kept hidden away in the darkest corner of her heart, sharing it only with the quiet darkness of her cabin. The truth was that Nora had been happily married to a good, quiet man named Thomas. Thomas was a hard-working farmhand who took whatever labor he could find across the county, driving cattle, repairing split-rail fences, and breaking his back from sunrise to sunset for a daily wage of $1.50. They had possessed very little in terms of worldly goods, but they had shared a simple, solid love and built modest plans for their future. On cool summer evenings, Thomas would sit on the porch step, carving a piece of cedar with his pocket knife, and talk about the day they would buy a couple of acres of their own, maybe keep a few milk cows, and build a proper barn. Nora had listened and believed him, because when you are young and in love, believing in a better tomorrow comes as natural as breathing. Fate, however, had a cruel way of intervening in the quiet lives of poor folks. 3 years into their marriage, during a rain-soaked autumn, a severe lung fever swept through the river valley like a thief in the night. It caught Thomas suddenly. One evening he came home with a slight chill, and by the next afternoon his body was racked with a burning fever that no cold compresses could break. There was no doctor living in their small township, and the physician in the county seat charged $15 just to ride out to the hollow. Money they simply did not have. Nora stayed by his bed for 4 days and 4 nights without sleeping, praying until her voice was a raspy whisper and wiping his forehead with spring water. On the 5th morning, just as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Thomas took one last shallow breath and grew still. Nora was left alone in a rented cabin, with $4 folded inside an old tin can, and, just a few weeks later, the overwhelming realization that she was carrying Thomas's child. She had not cried as much as she thought she would, mostly because the poor do not have the luxury of time to mourn. She buried her husband in the small churchyard down the hill, tucked his memory deep into her chest, and picked up her laundry tub the very next morning, because hunger does not honor grief. When the curious women at the town well tried to pry into her sorrow, offering hollow condolences that felt more like fishing for gossip than offering comfort, Nora answered with brief, polite words and quickly shifted the conversation back to the weather or the weight of the laundry. She refused to cheapen her grief by parading it before strangers. Her sorrow belonged to her alone, and she only permitted herself to feel its full, crushing weight at night, when the house fell completely silent, and the only sound was the mountain wind whistling through the pine trees outside her window. Yet, beneath the heavy shadow of Thomas's absence, there was another memory that kept Nora standing when her knees wanted to buckle. It was the memory of her grandmother, Abigail. As a young girl, Nora had spent long, sun-drenched summers at Abigail's farm, far up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Abigail had possessed the wisest, most capable hands Nora had ever known. Hands that knew the secret uses of every wild herb in the forest. Hands that had delivered hundreds of calves and lambs, and above all, hands that crafted the most rich, flavorful cheese in the entire county. For years, those memories had laid dormant in Nora's mind like cold coals. But lately, as her own life grew harder, Small sparks of those long-ago summer mornings were beginning to glow again. That fateful Tuesday morning had started like any other. Nora packed her clean, ironed linens into a neatly folded canvas wrap, lifted the burden to her hip, and began the long 3-kilometer walk down into the town square. The morning air was still crisp, smelling faintly of pine needle mold and distant wood smoke. She walked with a slow, measured tread, taking care with every step to protect the growing life within her. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the small town square was bustling with activity. Farmers had backed their pickup trucks and wooden wagons up to the gravel plaza, displaying crates of fresh peaches, yellow squash, and handmade baskets. Nora went from house to house along Main Street, delivering her pristine laundry and collecting her modest earnings, a handful of silver quarters and dimes that she carefully tied into a cotton handkerchief tucked safely inside her dress pocket. She was just finishing her rounds and preparing to start the long climb back up the mountain when a small crowd gathered near the old cast-iron water trough caught her attention. Tied to a wooden fence post by a frayed length of hemp rope stood a goat. The animal was clearly old and dangerously thin, her dull white coat dirty and matted with burrs. Her ribs stuck out like the wooden slats of a broken barrel, yet her belly hung extraordinarily low, swollen with an advanced pregnancy that seemed almost too heavy for her frail legs to support. She stood alone in the dirt, her head drooping, occasionally letting out a faint, raspy bleat that no one in the busy square bothered to heed. People walked past her without a second glance. A few men laughed, pointing at the ragged creature, before moving on to the livestock pens down the street. Nora stopped dead in her tracks. Something about the sight of that abandoned animal struck a chord so deep within her that it felt like a physical blow to her chest. 2 mothers, she thought, the realization washing over her like cold water. Both of us carrying new life. Both of us vulnerable, and both of us with nowhere truly safe to turn in this world. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, Nora walked over to the fence post. The goat turned her long face toward her. The animal's pale, rectangular pupilled eyes were ancient and liquid with a deep, quiet sadness. Nora reached out a hand, her rough fingers gently touching the coarse hair between the goat's ears. The animal didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned her heavy head softly against Nora's palm, sighing deeply, like a soul that hadn't felt a tender touch in far too long. In that silent moment, an unspoken understanding passed between the young woman and the old beast. A local livestock trader named Silas strolled over, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty road. He explained the situation with a careless shrug. The goat had belonged to Old Man Jenkins, an eccentric recluse who lived in a shack on the edge of the timberline. Jenkins had passed away 3 days ago, leaving behind no money, no will, and no family. The local deputy had auctioned off the old man's few belongings to cover the burial costs, but nobody wanted the goat. She was too old to be worth slaughtering, and she was so close to kidding that carrying her off seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Silas admitted that if no one took her by 5 o'clock that evening, he was simply going to untie the rope and turn her loose into the woods to let the coyotes have her. Nora listened, her heart tightening in her chest. She knew precisely what it felt like to be viewed as a burden, to be a mouth that nobody wanted to feed in a world that counted every penny. She looked down at the goat, and the goat looked back up at her with those quiet, trusting eyes. Reason screamed inside Nora's head to turn around and walk away. She barely had enough money to buy flour for the coming month. How could she possibly take on another living creature? But a deeper, older voice, a voice born of pure human empathy, refused to let her move her feet. She asked Silas how much he wanted for the animal. Silas chuckled, looking at Nora's worn dress and swollen belly. He named a price, $2.50. It was a paltry sum for livestock, but for Nora, it represented almost every single coin she had tied inside the cotton handkerchief against her chest. She stood in the dusty street for a long, agonizing moment, feeling the weight of her hard-earned money and the heavy flutter of her baby moving inside her. She did the math in her head. The flour she wouldn't be able to buy, the salt she would have to stretch, the lean weeks ahead. Yet, even as her mind calculated the danger, her hands were already untying the knot in her handkerchief. Slowly, deliberately, she counted out 10 silver quarters and placed them into Silas's weathered palm. She didn't buy the animal as an investment, nor was it an act of casual charity. It was a purchase made with her last resources in full view of the town. Sensing the skepticism of the onlookers, Nora made sure the transaction was witnessed. She turned to Mr. Henderson, the owner of the feed store who was standing on his porch, and asked him to confirm that the money had been paid in full. Mr. Henderson nodded, his expression a mixture of pity and bewilderment, and confirmed that the goat now legally belonged to Nora. As Nora took the hemp rope in her hand, a few men sitting on the porch of the general store began to chuckle. The whispers spread quickly across the square. They said the poor widow up in the hollow had finally lost her mind. A pregnant woman without a husband, spending her last $2.50 on a starving, useless goat that was likely to die before morning. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was the quiet, mocking kind that burned like lye on an open wound. Nora lowered her head, gripped the coarse rope tightly, and said nothing. She never argued with folks who didn't understand. The journey back up the mountain was long and excruciatingly slow. Woman and goat walked side by side along the dusty incline, both heavy with child, both measuring their strength against the steep grade of the road. Every few dozen yards, the goat would stop to nibble on a patch of clover growing along the ditch, and Nora would wait patiently, resting her own weary legs without rushing the animal. They didn't speak, of course, but the quiet companionship offered a strange solace. Neither of them was walking alone anymore. By the time they reached the small cottage, the evening sun was dropping behind the high peaks, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of fiery orange and deep violet. Nora led the goat into the small pine-pole barn, laid down a fresh bed of dry sweetgrass, and poured a bucket of cool, clear water from the well into a hollowed-out wooden trough. She stood by the fence, watching the animal drink thirstily, then gently placed her hand on her own stomach. The fatigue of the day settled heavy into her bones, but beneath the exhaustion was a nervous, fluttering fear. She now had 2 lives depending entirely on her, and the goat wasn't even producing a drop of milk yet. Looking at the old animal chewing quietly in the fading light, Nora honestly didn't know if she had just done the dumbest thing in her life or the only right thing her heart would allow. The first few days with the goat in the barn were far harder than Nora had anticipated. The animal arrived weak and exhausted, and the meager provisions Nora kept in her pantry now had to be stretched to keep 2 living beings alive. Every morning, after eating her small bowl of oatmeal, Nora would carry a handful of corn husks or a small bundle of tender green sprouts she had gathered along the creek bank out to the barn. She would stand there, watching the goat eat, feeling a quiet pang of anxiety as she calculated how quickly her tiny store of grain was disappearing. The stark truth remained unchanged. The goat was not producing a single drop of milk. She was heavy with child, her flanks tight, and her udder dry, serving as nothing more than another hungry mouth to feed. Nora knew this when she handed over her last coins in the town square, yet she could not bring herself to regret it. Whenever doubt crept into her thoughts during the quiet afternoon hours, she would walk down to the barn, look into the goat's gentle eyes, and find a calm that defied all practical logic. Some decisions in this life could not be measured on a banker's scale. Gradually, the old goat settled into the rhythm of the homestead. She stopped her restless bleating at night and began to recognize the sound of Nora's footsteps on the gravel path. Whenever Nora approached, the goat would walk to the edge of the wooden fence, pressing her soft nose against Nora's palm, waiting for a gentle stroke behind her ears. During the blistering heat of the afternoon, while Nora sat on the shaded porch scrubbing clothes, the goat would lay contentedly under the shade of a large oak tree nearby, chewing her cud and keeping a silent, watchful eye on the house. Without either of them explicitly acknowledging it, the deep isolation of the mountain hollow had been broken. One cool, starlit evening, with a thin sliver of the moon hanging over the ridge, Nora decided to give the animal a name. She walked out to the barn carrying a small oil lantern, its yellow flame flickering softly against the wooden slats. She sat down on a turned-up oak log beside the pen and looked at the goat resting in the straw. It felt wrong to keep calling her the goat, as if she were merely a piece of farm equipment rather than a companion. Nora pondered for a long time, searching her heart for a name that carried meaning, and finally whispered it into the quiet night air. "Molly," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the breeze in the trees. "Your name is Molly." She named the goat after her grandmother Abigail's sister, a resilient mountain woman who had survived harsh winters, lean harvests, and endless hardships with a quiet, unbroken dignity. Saying the name aloud felt like turning a key in an old, rusted lock. A flood of warmth rushed through Nora's chest, opening memories she thought time had swept away forever. Molly lifted her head, twitched her ears, and let out a soft, low bleat of approval. Nora smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. With that name came a torrent of forgotten childhood memories. Nora saw herself once again as a 7-year-old girl, running barefoot through the tall grass of her grandmother's farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She remembered her grandmother Abigail's hands, broad, weathered, and deeply lined, yet filled with an extraordinary, gentle skill. Abigail knew how to pull wild ginseng from the forest floor, how to soothe a fever with willow bark tea, and, above all else, how to turn simple goat's milk into rich, golden wheels of cheese that people traveled from miles around to buy. Nora remembered those crisp autumn mornings vivid as yesterday. Her grandmother would milk the goats at first light, strain the warm milk through a square of clean cheesecloth, and then temper it over a low fire with a natural coagulant gathered from specific wild plants that grew along the creek beds. Then came the magical part, cutting the curds with a long wooden knife, draining the sweet whey, salting the white mass by hand, and pressing it firmly into hand-carved wooden molds. Little Nora had watched every step with wide, fascinated eyes, and Abigail had often taken the young girl's small hands in her own, guiding them through the salt and curds, teaching her the subtle feel of the cheese. "Cheese ain't made with a strict recipe, child," Abigail used to say, her voice rich and warm like clover honey. "It's made with patience, clean hands, and a whole lot of love. If you try to rush it, you'll spoil the batch every single time." Nora had not thought about those words in over 15 years. Life had pulled her down different roads, away from the mountain farm, and when her grandmother passed away during Nora's teenage years, the knowledge seemed to have died with her. But now, sitting in the dim lantern light of her drafty barn with a pregnant goat resting at her feet, those old lessons returned with startling clarity, burning like long-buried coals suddenly stoked by a fresh mountain breeze. The weeks stretched on, slow and rhythmic. Both Nora's belly and Molly's flanks grew larger with each passing day, two mothers advancing toward the same miraculous threshold. Then, on a muggy September night when heavy thunderstorm clouds rolled over the mountain ridge, bringing a thick, humid stillness to the air, Molly began to show signs of labor. She became restless, pacing her small stall, shifting from side to side, and letting out low, pained grunts that cut straight through the quiet cottage. Nora woke instantly at the first sound. Wrapping her mother's woolen shawl around her shoulders, she grabbed the oil lamp and hurried out to the barn through the gathering darkness. She found Molly lying on her side in the straw, her breathing shallow and fast, her eyes wide with pain and distress. There was no vet to call, no neighbor within miles, and no husband to hold the lamp. It was just the two of them under the cedar rafters, and Nora knew that the fate of the animal and her unborn young rested entirely in her hands. Kneeling down in the dirty straw, ignoring the chill seeped into her knees and the discomfort in her own swollen frame, Nora spoke to Molly in a low, soothing tone. She petted the goat's damp forehead, whispering words of encouragement, comforting the beast just as she wished someone would comfort her when her own time arrived. She recalled everything her grandmother had taught her about animal births, staying calm, avoiding unnecessary interference, and letting nature take its course unless a crisis arose. The first kid was born just as the clock struck 2 in the morning. It was a strong, jet-black buckling that arrived slick and vigorous. Molly immediately began cleaning him with long, instinctive licks of her tongue. Nora let out a sigh of relief, watching the tiny creature struggle to stand on wobbly legs. But her relief was short-lived. Molly remained down, groaning deeply as her body went into another series of hard contractions. A few minutes later, the second kid arrived, but this one was far smaller, shockingly pale, and completely still. The tiny creature lay on the cold ground, wrapped in its birth sac, making no effort to breathe. Molly, exhausted and consumed with caring for her firstborn, did not reach out to the second. Nora knew that if she hesitated for even 30 seconds, the tiny kid would be lost. Without a second thought, she reached down, cleared the membrane from the newborn's face, and lifted the limp, freezing body into her arms. She wrapped the kid inside the warm fold of her woolen shawl, pressing it close against her chest. With practiced, gentle fingers, she cleared its tiny nostrils, rubbed its chest vigorously with the palm of her hand, and blew soft puffs of warm air into its mouth, just as she had watched her grandmother do decades ago. For several agonizing seconds, there was no response. Nora's heart pounded against her ribs as a wave of overwhelming sorrow threatened to crush her. In that fragile, dying creature, she saw a reflection of her own deep terrors. The fear that her own child might enter this world alone, weak and unable to survive the harsh cold of the mountain hollow. "Please," Nora whispered, tears welling in her eyes and spilling down her dusty cheeks. "Please live. Don't leave us. Fight for it." Suddenly, the little kid gave a sharp, violent cough. Its tiny legs jerked against Nora's chest, its body shuddered, and it let out a faint, high-pitched bleat that sounded like a rusty hinge. Nora gasped, holding the newborn tighter as a wave of pure, overwhelming gratitude washed over her. She stayed seated in the straw for a long time, weeping quietly into the newborn's damp fur, tears of exhaustion, relief, and a profound, renewed hope. When the kid was strong enough, Nora gently laid it down beside Molly. The mother goat immediately welcomed the second baby, licking it clean alongside its brother. Within an hour, both kids were standing on shaky, comical legs, nursing hungrily from Molly's full udder. Nora sat back against the wooden pen, watching the tiny family under the warm yellow glow of the lantern. Outside, the rain began to fall in soft, steady sheets, pattering peacefully against the wooden roof. For the first few days, Nora let the two kids have all the milk they needed, ensuring they grew strong and healthy under their mother's care. But Molly was an exceptional milker. Soon her udder was yielding far more than the two energetic kids could consume. One bright morning, after the kids had finished nursing, Nora sat down on a short three-legged stool, placed a clean stainless steel pail beneath Molly, and began to milk her. The streams of warm, rich milk hissed rhythmically against the metal bottom, quickly filling the bucket with a frothy, snow-white liquid. Nora carried the heavy pail into her kitchen, setting it on the wooden table. For a long moment, she simply stared at the abundance before her. For months she had lived on the absolute edge of starvation, counting every cup of meal and every pinch of salt. Now, standing in her sunny kitchen, She was holding over a gallon of fresh, nutrient-rich milk. Guided by intuition and the long-dormant memories of her grandmother's kitchen, Nora set to work. She strained the milk through a clean piece of muslin, warmed it gently on her stove, and added a small amount of the natural herbal extract she had gathered from the woods the afternoon before. Her hands moved with a strange automatic grace, remembering textures, temperatures, and timing that her mind had long forgotten. She cut the soft white curd with a long knife, drained the whey through cheesecloth, worked a handful of coarse salt into the mass, and pressed it firmly into a wooden hoop she fashioned from oak slats. By late afternoon, resting on her kitchen counter was a small, perfectly formed wheel of fresh farmer's cheese. It was pristine, smooth, and smelled faintly of sweet wild grass and spring water. Nora lifted the small wheel in her hands, holding it up to the warm sunlight filtering through the window. Tears filled her eyes once again. It wasn't just a block of food, it was a testament to resilience. It was her grandmother's legacy reborn through her own hands. It was tangible proof that the rash, desperate choice she had made in the town square weeks ago was not a failure, but the beginning of something extraordinary. That night, Nora knelt beside her small rope bed and offered a prayer of profound gratitude. She didn't ask for wealth or easy days. She simply thanked the Almighty for the goat, for the milk, and for guiding her hands. For the first time since Thomas had been laid to rest in the cold mountain earth, Nora went to sleep without a heavy knot of dread twisting in her stomach. Over the next 2 weeks, Nora's daily routine transformed completely. Every morning at dawn, she milked Molly, strained the sweet liquid, and set about the delicate art of cheese-making. At first, her batches were somewhat inconsistent. Some wheels turned out a little too soft, while others were slightly too salty, as her hands readjusted to the old craft. But Nora was persistent and observant, adjusting her methods daily until every round of cheese emerged from the wooden mold firm, white and delightfully creamy. One crisp Tuesday morning, Nora decided to test the waters down in town. She packed her usual bundle of clean laundry, but inside her canvas bag, carefully wrapped in clean, damp cabbage leaves to keep them cool, she nestled 2 fresh wheels of goat cheese. Her first stop was the modest home of Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow living at the edge of town, for whom Nora had washed clothes for over a year. Mrs. Gable was a stern, plain-spoken woman who rarely smiled, but she possessed a kind heart beneath her gruff exterior. As Nora handed over the stack of folded linens, she hesitated for a moment, reached into her bag, and pulled out one of the small cheese wheels. "Mrs. Gable," Nora said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she held out the package. "I brought something extra today. I was wondering if you might care to try it?" Mrs. Gable adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles, looking from the cheese to Nora's timid face with a look of sharp curiosity. She took the small white wheel, unwrapped the green leaf, and carried it over to her kitchen table. Without saying a word, she pulled a paring knife from a drawer, sliced off a small wedge, and placed it in her mouth. Nora stood by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, fully prepared for a polite rejection. But as Mrs. Gable chewed, her stern features visibly softened. Her eyes widened behind her thick lenses, and a look of genuine astonishment crossed her weathered face. "My goodness, child," Mrs. Gable murmured, setting the knife down on the table. "Where on earth did you get this?" "This tastes just like the farm cheese my mother used to make up in Virginia when I was a little girl. Smooth, rich, and clean. I haven't tasted anything like this in 40 years. "I made it myself," Nora replied, a quiet blush warming her cheeks. "From the goat I bought." Mrs. Gable looked at Nora with newfound respect. Without a moment's hesitation, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out 2 silver quarters, and placed them firmly in Nora's hand, insisting on paying for the wheel and ordering 2 more for the following week. Word of mouth in a small mountain town travels faster than a summer thunderstorm. Mrs. Gable didn't keep the discovery to herself. By that afternoon, she had mentioned the remarkable cheese to her sister at the church sewing circle, who in turn mentioned it to the pastor's wife. Within 4 days, 3 different townswomen walked up the dusty lane to Nora's homestead, wicker baskets in hand, eager to purchase fresh cheese directly from her kitchen. The very people who had whispered and chuckled at the sight of a poor, pregnant widow spending her last coins on a starving goat were now standing on her porch, holding out hard currency and addressing her with a warm respect she had never experienced before. Nora was no longer viewed merely as the pitied, struggling washerwoman at the end of the road. She was becoming the talented young woman who made the finest cheese in the county. The shift gave her something far more valuable than silver. It restored her sense of dignity and self-worth. However, a new challenge soon presented itself. Fresh goat cheese, while delicious, had a very short shelf life in the humid late summer heat. If it wasn't consumed within 3 or 4 days, it would spoil and go sour. On several occasions, Nora had to throw away valuable curds because a sudden rainstorm prevented her from walking down to town to deliver them. She realized that if she truly wanted to build a dependable livelihood, she needed to create a product that could endure time and travel. Once again, the memory of her grandmother Abigail provided the answer. Abigail hadn't just made fresh cheese. She was renowned for her aged, hard goat cheese, wheels that were heavily salted, pressed under great weight, and hung in cool, dark cellars to cure for weeks or even months. As these wheels aged, they developed a thick, golden-brown rind and a deep, complex, savory flavor that only grew richer with time. More importantly, aged cheese could be stored without refrigeration and transported over long distances without spoiling. Determined to master the technique, Nora transformed a small, cool pantry alcove on the north side of her cottage into a curing closet. She constructed smooth wooden shelves out of clean yellow pine planks and gathered heavy river stones to use as weights for her press. She doubled the amount of salt in her curds, pressed the wheels for 24 full hours until every drop of moisture was extracted, and then rubbed the outer rinds with a light coating of lard and wooden ash to protect them from molds and insects. The process required extraordinary patience and precision. Every single morning and evening, Nora had to enter the dim pantry, lift each heavy wooden wheel, turn it over, and scrub the rind with a clean, dry cloth to ensure proper aging. Her first 2 attempts were failures. One wheel cracked down the middle because the room was too dry, and another developed a bitter, unpleasant taste because it had been salted too heavily. But Nora refused to give up. She adjusted her methods, carefully monitored the air circulation, and poured her entire heart into the work. 3 weeks later, Nora cut into her first fully cured wheel. The rind was firm and golden, while the interior was dense, smooth, and possessed a rich, nutty flavor with just the right amount of sharp saltiness. It was a triumph. News of Nora's aged cheese soon reached Mr. Vance, the proprietor of the largest general mercantile store in the valley. Mr. Vance was a shrewd, practical businessman who catered not only to the local townsfolk, but also to travelers, loggers, and merchants passing through on the main county highway. Interested in the rumors, he sent his young clerk up the mountain to purchase a small wheel of the aged cheese. The following day, Mr. Vance himself drove his wooden delivery wagon right up to Nora's cottage. He stepped out onto the gravel, took off his felt hat, and offered Nora a direct business proposition. He offered to buy every single wheel of aged cheese she could produce, at a fair, guaranteed wholesale price, selling it directly from his store display counter. Nora stood on her front porch, listening to the merchant's offer, hardly able to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. What had started as a desperate act of compassion for a dying goat had blossomed into a real, sustainable business. She signed a simple 1-page agreement with Mr. Vance. using her neatest handwriting. For the first time since her husband's passing, Nora had a steady, reliable income that did not depend on hunching over a steaming washtub until her back broke. She was able to purchase a large sack of white flour, a barrel of cornmeal, fresh coffee, and soft cotton cloth to sew clothes for her coming baby, all without worrying about where her next meal would come from. When she looked out at the paddock, watching Molly lazily grazing alongside her two healthy, growing kids, Nora felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Yet, just as her life seemed to be settling into a beautiful, secure rhythm, a dark shadow appeared on the horizon. It was a chilly, overcast Thursday afternoon in early October when a stranger rode into the valley town. He was a tall, lean man in his late 40s, with a sun-bleached hat pulled low over his eyes, riding a scrawny bay horse. He went straight to the town square, stopping at the blacksmith shop, the tavern, and the post office, asking intrusive questions about an old white goat that had belonged to the late Silas Jenkins. His name was Judson, and he claimed to be a nephew of Old Man Jenkins, a distant relative who had spent the last several years working on railroad crews down in Georgia. Having heard of his uncle's death through a delayed letter, Judson had returned to the county expecting to claim whatever inheritance might be left. Upon discovering that his uncle's humble belongings had been sold off, and learning that the old abandoned goat had suddenly become famous for producing high-value cheese, a greedy calculation took hold of his mind. Judson made his way up Old Creek Road, his boots crunching loudly on the loose gravel. Nora was standing near her wooden drying racks, turning her cheese wheels, when she heard the horse approach. A cold sense of foreboding settled in her chest the moment she laid eyes on the man. His eyes were small, sharp, and constantly shifting, assessing the house, the barn, and the small herd with a predatory appraisal. He dismounted, tipped his hat with a slick, insincere politeness, and introduced himself as Old Man Jenkins's sole living heir. He expressed mock regret over his late arrival, but quickly pivoted to the real reason for his visit. "I've come for my uncle's property," Judson said, leaning against the fence rail and gesturing toward Molly, who was standing peacefully in the yard. "That goat belonged to blood family. The law says a man's estate passes to his kin. I intend to take her, along with her kids, down to the county market tomorrow morning." Nora's blood ran cold, her hands trembling beneath her apron. She took a step forward, forcing herself to stand tall despite her advanced pregnancy. "That animal was bought and paid for fair and square," Nora said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "She was left tied to a post in the middle of the town square for 3 days. Nobody wanted her. She was starving, and I paid $2.50 of my own hard-earned money to save her life. She belongs to me." Judson let out a dry, harsh laugh that held no humor whatsoever. He stepped closer to the fence, his expression turning cold and menacing. "A simple widow's word don't mean much against a blood relative's legal claim, lady," he sneered, looking down at her swollen belly. "My uncle was old and out of his mind when he died. Whoever put that goat up for sale in the square had no legal right to sell my family's property. You took advantage of an old man's passing. Either you hand over that goat and her offspring right now, or I'll bring the county sheriff up here to take them by force, and I'll have you cited for taking stolen property." The threat hung in the cool mountain air like a poison. Judson gave a cruel, knowing grin, mounted his horse, and trotted back down the lane, calling over his shoulder that he would return at noon the following day with the law to claim his property. Nora stood alone in her yard as the sound of the horse's hooves faded into the distance. The world seemed to spin around her. All the security, all the dignity, and all the hope she had built over the past few months suddenly felt as fragile as a dry leaf in the wind. She knew how the legal system often treated poor, solitary women in those mountain counties. If Judson filed a formal complaint, she had no high-priced lawyer to represent her, no influential family to speak on her behalf, and no formal bill of sale signed by a judge. That night, Nora could not sleep. She sat by her small kitchen window, wrapped in her mother's woolen shawl, clutching her wooden rosary beads in her lap. Outside, the night wind howled through the pine trees, rattling the wooden shutters. She looked out at the dark silhouette of the barn where Molly slept, feeling a deep, crushing sorrow. It wasn't just about losing the goat or the income from the cheese. It was the sheer injustice of it all. The feeling that no matter how hard a poor person worked, no matter how honestly they lived, someone stronger and more ruthless could always come along and tear it all away. She prayed in silence, tears streaming down her face, asking for guidance and strength to protect the life she had worked so hard to build. News of Judson's threats spread through the valley town like wildfire the following morning. Judson had spent the early hours boasting at the local tavern about how he was going to take back his uncle's goat and sell her for a handsome profit, now that she was known as a valuable milker. But he had badly miscalculated the sentiment of the community. The people of the town had watched Nora's quiet struggle over the past year. They had seen her haul heavy laundry through snow and heat without a word of complaint. They had tasted the magnificent cheese she crafted with her own bare hands, and they had come to respect her quiet grace and unwavering honesty. More importantly, they remembered the day she had purchased the animal. When Judson walked into the magistrate's office at 11 o'clock that morning, demanding a warrant to seize the livestock, he found the room already occupied. Standing beside the magistrate's heavy oak desk was Mrs. Gable, looking fierce and resolute, along with Mr. Vance from the mercantile store, and Mr. Henderson, the feed store owner, who had witnessed the transaction months ago. Before Judson could even open his mouth, Mr. Henderson stepped forward, placing his heavy, leather-bound ledger on the desk. "Judge," Mr. Henderson declared in a clear, ringing voice that carried into the hallway, "this man is a fraud. I was standing less than 10 feet away on the morning of August 14th, when Silas, acting on behalf of the town council to clear Old Man Jenkins's unpaid burial expenses, offered that dying goat to anyone who would pay $2.50 for her. This young woman, Nora, stepped forward when no one else in this county would give a dime. She paid full cash value in front of 4 witnesses. That sale was lawful, proper, and binding." Mrs. Gable then stepped forward, her eyes flashing with indignant anger as she glared at Judson. "Furthermore, Judge," Mrs. Gable added, slamming her hand lightly on the desk for emphasis, "where was this dutiful nephew when Old Man Jenkins was freezing in his shack last winter? Where was he when the poor old man was buried in a potter's field? He was nowhere to be found. He only slithered back into this valley when he smelled money that a hard-working widow earned through her own sweat and blood. If you take that animal away from that poor girl, you'll have to answer to every decent citizen in this township." The magistrate, a fair-minded man who had lived in the county for 30 years, looked at Judson over the top of his spectacles. He asked Judson if he possessed any written proof of ownership, a bill of sale, or any evidence that he had ever provided care or financial support for his late uncle. Judson stammered, his slick confidence completely evaporating under the stern gazes of the townspeople, unable to produce a single document. The magistrate picked up his wooden gavel, struck the sound block with a decisive thud, and officially declared that the sale of the goat to Nora was legal, final, and absolute. He explicitly warned Judson that if he set foot on Nora's property or harassed her in any way, he would be immediately arrested and thrown into the county jail for trespassing. Beaten and thoroughly humiliated, Judson slunk out of the magistrate's office, mounted his horse without saying another word to anyone, and rode out of the county before nightfall, never to be seen again. Up at the homestead, Nora was sitting on her porch, her eyes red from a sleepless night, holding a warm cup of herbal tea. She saw a small procession coming up Old Creek Road. It wasn't the sheriff or Judson. It was Mr. Vance's delivery wagon, driven by Mr. Vance himself, with Mrs. Gable sitting proudly beside him on the wooden bench. When the wagon pulled up to the yard, Mrs. Gable climbed down, walked up the porch steps, and took Nora's trembling hands in her own. She recounted everything that had transpired in the magistrate's office, her face beaming with victory. "He's gone, child," Mrs. Gable said gently, patting Nora's hands. "He won't ever trouble you again. You and Molly are safe. The whole town made sure of it." Nora stood on her porch, overwhelmed by a emotion so profound it took her breath away. She had spent so many months believing she was utterly alone in the world, fighting a solitary battle against poverty and grief. But in her hour of need, the community she had quietly served had wrapped its arms around her, standing as a formidable shield between her and injustice. The quiet acts of honesty, labor, and kindness she had put out into the world had returned to her tenfold. She wept freely, not out of fear or sorrow, but out of immense, overflowing gratitude. 3 weeks after the trouble with Judson was put to rest, on a quiet, frost-kissed November morning, as the first bright autumn leaves began to drift gently down from the maple trees, Nora went into labor. This time, however, she was not alone in the dark. As soon as the first signals began, young Tommy Gable, Mrs. Gable's grandson who came by daily to assist with chores, ran down to town at a full sprint. Within 30 minutes, a wagon arrived at the cottage carrying Mrs. Gable, 2 experienced neighborhood women, and Dr. Reynolds, a kindly retired physician who lived down near the river. They filled the drafty cottage with warmth, steaming pots of water, clean white linens, and soft, encouraging voices. Mrs. Gable sat right beside Nora, holding her hand firmly through every contraction, dabbing her forehead with a damp cloth, and whispering words of motherly strength into her ear. Nora felt a deep, steadying peace wash over her. The terrifying shadow of isolation that had haunted her for months was completely gone, replaced by the loving presence of women who had become her chosen family. Just as the bright autumn sun reached its zenith in the clear blue sky, filling the bedroom with golden light, the quiet cottage echoed with the sharp, vigorous cry of a newborn baby. It was a healthy, beautiful baby girl, with a thick tuft of dark hair and dark, bright eyes that mirrored her father's gentle spirit. Dr. Reynolds wrapped the child in a soft flannel blanket and placed her tenderly into Nora's eager arms. Exhausted, weeping tears of pure joy, Nora pressed the tiny bundle close against her heart, kissing her daughter's soft cheek. She named the baby Abigail, after her grandmother, whose ancient knowledge and loving legacy had paved the way for their survival. When the women had finished caring for mother and child, and the cottage fell into a quiet, peaceful stillness, Mrs. Gable gently pulled back the window curtains. Outside in the sunny yard, Molly stood by the wooden fence, her 2 healthy kids gamboling playfully around her legs in the dry leaves. The old nanny goat turned her head toward the window, letting out a soft, low bleat, as if acknowledging the new arrival and greeting the baby girl who would grow up surrounded by the abundance her mother had built. The years that followed were filled with hard work, but also with unprecedented blessings and prosperity. Nora's modest home operation gradually expanded into a thriving mountain dairy. With her steady savings, she was able to purchase the surrounding 10 acres of lush pastureland, build a spacious, dry barn, and add several more fine dairy goats to her herd, all direct descendants of Old Molly. She hired 2 local widows, who had fallen on hard times, teaching them the delicate art of cheesemaking just as her grandmother had taught her, giving them gainful employment, dignity, and a reliable means to support their own children. The small frame cottage at the end of Old Creek Road became a warm, bustling sanctuary, known throughout the entire state for producing the finest aged goat cheese in the region. Little Abigail grew up healthy, strong, and exceptionally joyful, her childhood filled with the sweet laughter of running through clover pastures caring for young kids, and learning the secrets of the cheese pantry at her mother's knee. Old Molly lived out her remaining years in comfort and peace, pampered like royalty, resting under the shade of the grand oak tree, until she peacefully passed away at a very old age. Nora buried the faithful animal in a sunny corner of the pasture, under a flowering hawthorn bush, placing a smooth river stone at the site, with a heart full of eternal gratitude. Looking back across the long span of years, sitting on her spacious front porch, as the sun dipped behind the majestic mountain ridge, casting that familiar copper glow across the valley, Nora understood the deepest truth of her life's journey. In this life, we often find ourselves facing moments of overwhelming darkness, standing at the edge of despair with nothing left in our hands but a few metaphorical pennies and a heavy heart. In those moments of deep testing, the world often urges us to be cold, calculating, and guarded, to save only ourselves and close our eyes to the suffering of others. Yet, it is precisely when we choose to act out of pure, unselfish compassion, when we extend a gentle hand to another struggling creature, no matter how small, humble, or unwanted they may seem, that we invite the miraculous into our lives. True abundance in this human experience is never measured by the gold held in a bank vault or the fleeting status granted by strangers. It is cultivated slowly, day by day, through the quiet integrity of our daily labor, the courageous resilience of our spirit in the face of hardship, and the quiet, persistent love we pour into the world around us. What the cynical world often dismisses as foolishness or a waste of precious resources is frequently the very seed from which our greatest blessings will grow. When we sow seeds of genuine kindness, without expecting anything in return, those seeds never truly rot in the dirt. They take root in the most unexpected places, watered by faith and nurtured by time, until they blossom into a bountiful harvest of dignity, community, and peace. We are never truly as alone as we fear. Divine grace has a quiet, profound way of working through the most humble instruments in creation, a forgotten memory, a helpful neighbor, or even a skinny, unwanted goat, to show us that love, once given freely, always finds its way back home.